For 20 years, no one in Ashford saw John Thompson because his own mother had locked him away. The truth was whispered only in shadows, spoken cautiously by those who remembered the boy before he vanished from the town's sight. The grey wooden house at the far edge of Ashford was always quiet, always shuttered, and on some nights a faint cry seemed to escape from within, carried across the frozen fields like a sound the world had almost forgotten. Margaret Thompson had lived there alone, or so the townspeople believed. She appeared at church only rarely, always in black, moving like a woman who had long abandoned hope or comfort. She never smiled. She never lingered. She never invited conversation. People spoke of her in hushed tones, avoiding her gaze if they passed by. Even children, naturally curious, instinctively steered clear. There was a stillness about the house that made people uncomfortable, a sense that life inside did not flow the way it did elsewhere in Ashford. The story began decades earlier, when Ashford was little more than a scattering of farms, muddy roads, and a blacksmith shop. Margaret arrived as a young bride, full of laughter and life, married to William Thompson, a skilled carpenter who helped build much of the town's first homes and barns. William was known for his steady hands and a patience rare in men of his trade. He had a gentle nature, and in Margaret he had found a woman who shared his quiet attention to detail and care for their home. Their son, John, was born in the early 1830s during a violent summer storm. Thunder rattled the windows the moment he cried for the first time. Some later said it was a sign, though what it might signify no one could say for certain. John grew into a quiet child, unusually introspective. While other boys ran in the fields, climbed trees, and hunted small game by the creek, John often remained in the house, tracing patterns in the floorboards, studying the shapes of shadows, or watching dust swirl in the sunlight. His attention to small details was unnerving to some, fascinating to others, but mostly it set him apart. Margaret adored him, fiercely protective from the start. She shielded him from the teasing of other children and from the blunt judgments of neighbors. "He is delicate," she would say. "He must not be overexerted." Teachers who criticized him were met with her quiet insistence that John's temperament required special attention. Over time, the boy began to vanish from public view, not out of malice, but because Margaret had created a world in which he was safe from anything that might hurt him. The townspeople, respectful of privacy and unaware of how extreme her measures would become, accepted her explanations. Tragedy struck suddenly when John was just 8 years old. William Thompson fell from the roof of the church he had been repairing. His death was instantaneous, leaving Margaret a widow in her early 30s, responsible for both her household and the young boy, whose quiet ways had already begun to alienate him from the rest of the town. Neighbors offered condolences, gifts of food and promises of help, but Margaret declined. She retreated into the house with John and never again allowed the boy to wander freely into Ashford. By the time John turned 10, he had disappeared almost entirely from the community's eye. Few remembered seeing him at the church, and those who did described a boy who lingered at the edges of the pews, silent, always observing, never speaking except when spoken to. Rumors began to circulate. Some assumed he had been sent to live with distant relatives. Others whispered of an illness that had claimed him quietly. No one questioned the explanations. In Ashford, the word of a grieving widow was rarely disputed. Privacy was respected, sometimes to a fault. Years passed. Seasons turned. By 1851, nearly 20 years had elapsed without a sighting of John Thompson. Margaret's house remained an unmoving sentinel at the edge of Ashford. Its paint had long since faded to a dull grey. Shutters hung crookedly. The yard grew wild, and yet Margaret remained inside unchanged. Occasionally the townspeople would see her leaving the house for church, or walking quietly to the well to draw water. But she spoke to no one, greeted no one, and rarely even glanced at the people she passed. The townspeople speculated endlessly. Had John died? Had Margaret hidden him for some reason no one could fathom? And yet, for all the questions, few dared to approach the house. Something about it and about Margaret herself stirred unease in even the most courageous residents. Everything changed the day Elijah Parker arrived, a traveling peddler, moving between towns with cloth, tools and household goods. He had no reason to linger at the Thompson property until he heard it. From somewhere beneath the old floorboards came a faint, tortured sound. Not the wind. Not an animal. A human voice. Thin, desperate and pleading, calling as though forgotten by the world. Elijah stopped his wagon and called toward the house. No answer came. Slowly, the front door creaked open and Margaret Thompson stepped outside. Her expression was calm, unreadable, almost chilling. "You are trespassing," she said, voice steady and final. Elijah apologized and left, but the sound he had heard stayed with him, echoing in his mind long after he had moved on. That evening at the general store he mentioned it casually. Most townspeople laughed. Old houses made noises. Animals sometimes became trapped in basements. But one elderly woman listening by the stove leaned forward. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I remember that boy," she said. "John Thompson." The room fell silent. The name hung in the air like a shadow long forgotten, but never gone. Questions began to stir. Where had John Thompson been for 20 years? And why had no one, not the neighbors, not the church, not the town officials, ever seen him again? Even those who had seen him as a child struggled to recall details. His quiet voice, the solemn way he walked, the careful precision of his hands, these memories returned, like faint echoes of another life. The more they thought, the more impossible it seemed that a child could vanish so completely without leaving a trace. Margaret continued her life inside the Thompson house, maintaining the appearance of normalcy. She drew water from the well each morning, fed a small dog and tended her modest garden. But anyone who looked closely could see the cracks in her routine. Windows permanently shuttered, doors bolted from the inside, and the faint, unnatural hush that always lingered around the house. And beneath the floorboards, someone waited. The next winter in Ashford was harsher than most. Bitter winds whipped through the bare trees, rattling the shutters of every house along the main road, and snow clung stubbornly to the fields. Yet even in the cold, the Thompson house seemed untouched by the season, as though it existed in its own frozen world. Smoke rose from the chimney each morning, but the source of warmth and life within remained a mystery to the townspeople. Inside, Margaret moved with a careful precision that made every visitor feel as if they had entered a different realm entirely. She performed each task in silence, sweeping the floorboards, stoking the fireplace, and tending a small stove that filled the house with a faint scent of burnt wood. Every movement was deliberate, every sound measured. To anyone watching from the outside, she appeared to maintain the routines of a normal widow. Yet in truth, the house held secrets no one could imagine. John Thompson had lived in that house for nearly 2 decades, a boy who had grown into a man without ever stepping outside the front door. His life was contained within the walls Margaret had built around him. Each room had its purpose, a small study where he learned to read from the worn books his mother had brought, a sparsely furnished bedroom where he slept, and a hidden chamber beneath the floorboards, known only to Margaret, where he spent the longest hours of his days. The hidden chamber was a place of shadows and silence. Margaret had constructed it carefully when John was still a child, and it was designed to be completely inaccessible to the outside world. A trapdoor concealed beneath a loose rug led to a narrow staircase descending into the dim space. There, John's world was limited to what light could filter through a tiny slit in the wall, and to the faint, muffled sounds of the house above. Time passed differently in that room. Days and nights blurred, seasons changed beyond the windows he had never seen, yet John survived. He learned to occupy his mind with reading, memorizing passages from books and silently recounting stories to himself. He listened to his mother's footsteps above and learned to measure their rhythm, to anticipate when she would appear at the trapdoor or call his name. The discipline of his isolation created in him a strange attentiveness to small details, an almost unnatural patience. Still, the boy, who had once wandered the house freely, had long been replaced by a man shaped entirely by confinement. Margaret's behavior became increasingly peculiar as the years passed. She rarely left the house, except to attend church on the coldest Sundays or to collect necessities from the small general store. Her dress remained the same, black from head to toe, as if mourning the life she had lost and the one she had taken from her son. Neighbors whispered that she had grown cruel with age, though none could point to evidence beyond her cold demeanor. Those who dared approach the property reported an oppressive silence, a sense that the air around the house itself was thick with unease. It was Elijah Parker, the traveling peddler, who unknowingly uncovered the first hints of John's existence. While passing the Thompson property one late afternoon, he had heard the faint, desperate cries. The sounds were subtle, easy to dismiss, but Elijah could not shake the feeling that they were human. Later, as he recounted the incident at the general store, Margaret's name surfaced like a shadow over the conversation. Some laughed, some ignored him, but others, particularly those who had known John as a boy, felt a chill. Inside the house, Margaret had her reasons. She told herself that she was protecting John from the world that had taken his father, from the ridicule that might come from his differences, from any harm that might befall a boy whose temperament was delicate and unusual. But over the years, the protection transformed into control. The line between care and cruelty blurred until it no longer existed. She measured his days, controlled his movements, dictated what he could see, what he could touch, and when he could speak. The hidden chamber became both prison and sanctuary. John adapted, but the long isolation shaped his mind and body in ways Margaret could not have predicted. His muscles were lean and wiry from climbing the stairs repeatedly to reach the kitchen or small study, but his frame lacked the strength a young man would normally possess from outdoor life. His eyes, once bright with curiosity, now held a quiet vigilance, constantly scanning the shadows. Every noise above or below became a signal he learned to interpret. The world had shrunk to the dimensions of the house, yet it had become immeasurably vast in his mind. Margaret did not speak often to her son. When she did, it was with careful, measured words. She emphasized obedience, the importance of silence, and the need to follow her instructions without question. Any hint of resistance or complaint was met with quiet but firm correction. She reminded him constantly that the outside world was cruel, dangerous and unfit for him. For John, the house became the only place of safety, yet safety was indistinguishable from confinement. Neighbors had begun to take notice of the unusual rhythm of the Thompson house. The yard was overgrown, the shutters permanently closed, and Margaret rarely appeared in public. Rumors began to swirl that something unnatural was happening within those walls. Children whispered about the say, sounds they sometimes heard, and dared each other to peek through the windows, but no one stayed long. Even the adults felt a vague apprehension, sensing the weight of a secret they could not name. It was in this quiet, tense environment that John learned the discipline of waiting. He observed the house, memorized the cadence of his mother's footsteps, and anticipated her movements with precision. He learned to suppress fear and doubt, though they were always present beneath the surface. Days stretched into months, months into years, and John measured his life not by the sun or the seasons, but by the routines Margaret enforced. Though he had never ventured beyond the front door, John's mind wandered freely. He read the books Margaret allowed him, imagined worlds far beyond Ashford, and remembered fragments of the childhood he had lost. In the small hours of the night, he would whisper stories to himself, sometimes aloud, sometimes in silence, as though reciting to a world he would never see. The voice he had once used sparingly became his companion, the only constant in a life otherwise defined by absence and isolation. Yet John did not blame his mother entirely. He understood in the limited way a confined mind could that Margaret believed she was protecting him. Her actions, however extreme, had a logic she would defend without hesitation. Still deep within him lingered a longing for freedom, a curiosity about the world he had been denied, and a sense of life passing by beyond the walls of the Thompson house. As the months of 1851 wore on, John's existence remained hidden. The cries that Elijah Parker had heard earlier in the year persisted, subtle and faint, almost drowned out by the ordinary noises of the town. Few people paid them any attention. Margaret maintained the routines, and John continued to observe, to learn and to endure. Every day brought the same mix of monotony, discipline and small bursts of imagination, a life contained entirely within the house at the edge of Ashford. By early spring of 1851, the Thompson house had become more than a quiet home. It was a source of unease for the entire town of Ashford. The snow had melted, revealing tangled weeds and the beginnings of a small garden Margaret tended meticulously. Yet even this routine was unsettling to onlookers. The yard was rarely visited by anyone other than her, and even the local children avoided it, though some dared to wander near the fence, only to flee at the slightest noise. Inside, life followed a rigid, unchanging pattern. John Thompson moved silently between the hidden chamber, the study and the kitchen. He had learned to anticipate every sound in the house, the creak of the stairs, the gentle clink of Margaret's utensils, the faint rattle of the front door when the wind pressed against it. Every footstep above him was a signal, every silence a warning. He had become attuned to the house in a way that blurred the line between observer and prisoner. Margaret rarely spoke, and when she did, it was with authority. She reminded John of the dangers outside, of the cruelty that awaited those unprotected by the walls she had built around him. She told him that Ashford's streets were unforgiving, that townspeople were careless with their judgments, and that his delicate nature would never survive beyond the home. To Margaret, her control was protection. To John, it was a life measured in shadows and muted sounds. But even Margaret could not control everything. Strange occurrences began to stir curiosity among the townspeople. A passing peddler reported hearing faint sobs, almost like a child's escaping from beneath the floorboards. Farmers claimed the house seemed to shift slightly, a subtle movement, as though someone inside watched from the windows. A new schoolteacher, recently arrived in Ashford, noted the empty yard, the dark shutters, and the absence of any child in the community with the Thompson name, and could not shake the sense that something was being hidden. John, confined for nearly 20 years, had developed an acute awareness of the smallest details. He noticed when visitors lingered outside, when horses approached the house, and even when someone paused briefly in the lane. Yet he had learned to remain unseen. Any sign of movement, any voice was carefully muted or withheld. And yet, for all his caution, he longed for more than the hidden life he had been given. The world beyond the walls called to him in fragments of memory, in the stories Margaret allowed him to read, and in fleeting imaginings of sunlight that he had never fully experienced. One afternoon, a neighbor named Mrs. Caldwell stopped by, ostensibly to borrow sugar, though her real purpose was curiosity. She lingered at the edge of the yard, watching the Thompson house. "Margaret," she called, trying to keep her voice pleasant but firm. "Are you well?" We haven't seen John in ages. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, but her response was measured. "John is well," she said. "He has everything he needs here. There is no cause for concern." Her tone left no room for argument, and Mrs. Caldwell, uneasy, turned away. Yet the encounter only deepened the town's questions. Inside, John listened. He heard every word, every pause, every step retreating from the porch. His chest tightened. For the first time in years, he felt a pang of frustration so strong it threatened to overwhelm his careful self-control. He wanted to step outside, to feel the sun on his face, to hear the full sounds of the town. But he remained still as Margaret instructed, as he had always done. Safety and confinement were one and the same in the house that had become his entire world. Margaret's control did not waver, though tension had begun to ripple in her own behavior. She checked the windows frequently, bolted doors with extra care, and spent hours pacing the rooms, as if anticipating some intrusion from the outside. She reminded John constantly that any deviation from her rules could be disastrous, though she never explained exactly why. Her instructions became more precise, more rigid, and yet, strangely, her voice occasionally trembled, betraying the anxiety she had long hidden. On quiet nights, John would whisper to himself, a habit formed over years of isolation. If anyone is watching, like the peddler or the neighbors, he would murmur softly, let them see, let them know, and then he would stop, knowing the risk of discovery could provoke Margaret's anger. Still, the desire to connect, to be acknowledged, persisted in small, dangerous ways. It was during these months that Elijah Parker, the peddler, returned to Ashford. He had been away for a few weeks, selling cloth and simple tools in neighboring towns. As he approached the Thompson property again, he noticed the subtle signs that had troubled him before. The unbroken silence of the yard, the faint flutter of curtains despite the locked windows, and the eerie feeling that someone was watching him from inside. He paused for a long moment, considering whether to approach the house, and then moved on, though a lingering curiosity gnawed at him. Meanwhile, John's days continued in isolation. He spent hours reading, imagining, and rehearsing quiet conversations with strangers he would never meet. His world was small, but his mind had grown expansive, filled with memories of the limited life he once knew and the imagined possibilities of freedom. He had learned to measure hope carefully, allowing himself only brief glimpses of longing, never enough to distract him from the strict routines Margaret enforced. At times, Margaret would bring John small gifts, a new book, a piece of cloth, or something to eat that she had procured herself. These gestures were never accompanied by warmth. They were reminders that she provided for him, that she controlled his world, and that her authority was absolute. John accepted these items silently, grateful for their utility, but resentful of the continued confinement that accompanied them. The town of Ashford, meanwhile, had begun to notice small unexplained details, missing items from the general store, rumors of soft cries in the night, and the house's unnerving stillness made the Thompson property a subject of whispered speculation. Children dared each other to peek through gaps in the fence, though few actually stayed long enough to see anything. Adults exchanged uneasy glances when walking past the house, and for the first time in years, Margaret's authority over the perception of her home began to feel precarious. John, from his hidden chamber, noticed the changes too. The attention of outsiders, however faint, created both fear and fascination. He had lived most of his life in silence, yet the presence of people beyond the walls stirred thoughts he had long suppressed. A small ember of hope began to grow, a dangerous spark, but one he could not entirely extinguish. He longed to speak, to move, to step beyond the confinement he had endured for nearly 2 decades. And so the days passed in quiet tension, the rhythm of life inside the Thompson house unchanged, but charged with a new, subtle energy. The town outside remained unaware of the full truth, yet every sound, every visitor, every passing glance reminded John of the fragile boundary between his world and theirs. It was a world of shadows and whispers, of careful observation and small acts of defiance, yet it was the only world he had ever known. If you're following this story and want to see what happens next, don't forget to like and comment where you're watching. From Every Insight helps share the story of John Thompson's hidden life with others who can't believe what happened in Ashford. As the days grew longer and spring unfurled across Ashford, the Thompson house seemed heavier somehow, as if it carried the tension of every shadow and secret within its walls. Margaret Thompson's routines had grown more obsessive. She checked locks repeatedly, inspected shutters for even the tiniest crack, and patrolled the floors as though intruders could appear at any moment. The calm precision of her earlier years had hardened into something sharper, almost frantic. John had long adapted to the patterns of the house, yet he noticed subtle changes in his mother. Her gaze lingered longer on the windows. Her steps through the hallways carried a new urgency, and sometimes, for a brief moment, Her hands trembled while fastening a lock. He understood that the house, once a controlled sanctuary, was beginning to feel precarious even to Margaret herself. Outside neighbors whispered more openly. Children dared to peer through gaps in the fence, quickly retreating when shadows shifted inside. Farmers passing. The property spoke in hushed tones, about faint sounds, almost cries, others that seemed to rise from the house at odd hours. Even the town preacher, a man accustomed to visiting families, privately remarked that the Thompson home carried an unusual chill, a feeling that something hidden and unnatural thrived within its walls. Margaret sensed these small intrusions and responded with heightened vigilance. She patrolled from room to room, double-checked doors and windows, and reminded John constantly of the dangers that lurked beyond the property line. "The world outside is cruel," she would say, her voice low and sharp. "No one will understand him like I do. You must never forget that." John nodded silently, understanding that obedience was necessary for survival, though the repetition of her warnings only fueled a quiet, simmering defiance within him. One afternoon, a minor incident shook the fragile equilibrium of the house. A branch from the large oak inn. The yard broke and struck the shutter with a sharp crack. Margaret's face drained of color. She rushed through the rooms, checking every lock, bolting doors, and inspecting the windows. John watched from the hidden chamber, heart pounding, knowing how quickly a single disturbance could transform routine into hours of scrutiny. The sound was brief, almost trivial, yet it had stirred a storm of anxiety that neither of them could ignore. Rumors in Ashford continued to grow. Neighbors noticed subtle signs, the faint flutter of curtains, shadows moving behind closed shutters, and the eerie stillness of the yard. Conversations in the general store included soft mentions of the hidden boy and the house at the edge of town. Some laughed it off. Others, especially those who remembered John as a child, felt unease settle deep in their bones. Inside, John's world remained confined, yet his awareness had grown sharper. He memorized the rhythm of Margaret's movements, the subtle shifts in her moods, and the noises outside the walls. He imagined what lay beyond the fence, the streets of Ashford he had never walked, the sunlight he had never fully felt. These thoughts were dangerous, yet he could not suppress them. The spark of curiosity, long dormant, was growing stronger. Margaret, for her part, continued to enforce her rules with an intensity born of fear. Her warnings were precise, her instructions unyielding, yet cracks in her authority were beginning to show. She would glance at John for longer than necessary, sometimes muttering under her breath, other times pausing mid-step, as if trying to anticipate some invisible threat. The balance of control she had maintained for decades was wobbling, and both mother and son felt the subtle tremors of change in the house. Evening shadows brought with them a tense quiet. John would sit in the hidden chamber, imagining life beyond the walls, the sounds of the town, the faces of strangers he had never met. Each imagined moment was a whisper of freedom, a dangerous reminder of the life he had been denied. And as he listened to Margaret's careful pacing above, he knew that the world outside was edging closer with every passing day. At times he would whisper softly to himself, a habit developed over years of isolation. If anyone is following this story, like and comment where you're watching from. It was a small connection to the outside, a reminder that the hidden life within the house was not entirely invisible. Even in secrecy, John found a way to reach beyond the walls that had confined him for so long. The Thompson house teetered on the edge of revelation. The subtle disturbances outside, the cracks in Margaret's vigilance, and the growing awareness within John suggested that the careful balance they had maintained for decades might not hold for much longer. Shadows were moving, both within and beyond the house, and the story of the boy hidden from Ashford was far from over. The days grew warmer, and the town of Ashford stirred with its usual quiet routines, but the Thompson house seemed untouched by the rhythms of life outside. Margaret Thompson's vigilance had reached a fevered pitch. Every door, every shutter, every lock was checked multiple times a day. She walked the floors with a taut precision, pausing frequently, as though expecting some unseen threat to appear at any moment. Her hands were rarely still, and the tight line of her mouth betrayed a tension that had become impossible to hide. John moved with careful grace through the house, keenly aware of the subtle changes in his mother's demeanor. He had spent almost 2 decades reading the silent language of the Thompson house, the creak of a floorboard, the shift of a curtain, the faintest scrape of a chair. Every sound, every pause carried meaning. The house had been his prison, but it had also made him a master of observation. And yet, even his disciplined mind could not ignore the growing pressure from the outside world. Strangers were becoming unavoidable. One afternoon, a delivery man appeared at the front door, carrying a small package. Margaret froze, peering through the keyhole, her eyes narrowing. "Leave it there," she said sharply. The man hesitated, unsure of her tone, and then placed the parcel on the step before retreating. Margaret slammed the door and secured every bolt with trembling hands. John, from his hidden chamber, felt a mixture of relief and fascination. Every encounter with the world beyond the walls reminded him of what he had never experienced, and each tiny crack in Margaret's control made his mind race with dangerous possibilities. Rumors in Ashford had begun to circulate more boldly. Neighbors spoke in hushed voices about the sounds they sometimes heard from the Thompson house, of faint cries, shadows moving behind tightly shut shutters, and the oppressive stillness of the yard. Children dared each other to peek through the fence, retreating in fear or excitement at the slightest movement inside. Even the preacher, a man who knew the lives of every family in town, admitted privately that he felt a strange unease whenever he passed the property. Inside, Margaret's instructions to John grew sharper, more insistent. She reminded him constantly that the world outside was cruel, that no one would protect him, and that any disobedience could have disastrous consequences. Her warnings were precise, bordering on obsessive, yet each carried an unmistakable undercurrent of fear. John absorbed the lessons silently, understanding that the rules of survival were absolute, yet his thoughts often wandered to the world he had never known. John's quiet rebellion had grown in small, careful ways. He experimented with moving more quickly, listening more closely, and imagining life beyond the house. The hidden chamber, once a place of complete confinement, had become a private space for planning and reflection. Each day he studied the patterns of the house, the behavior of Margaret, and the distant noises from the town. Every detail was a clue, every opportunity a possibility. Evenings were the most tense. John would crouch in the shadows of the hidden chamber, listening to Margaret's pacing, her muttered warnings, the faint creak of locks and floorboards. Outside, the wind carried distant voices and the faint creak of horses on the roads. The boundaries of his world had always been clear, but now they seemed porous, fragile. The world outside was pressing in, and for the first time in decades, John felt the thrill and danger of potential discovery. Margaret's control, though formidable, showed cracks. She spoke more urgently, acted with more suspicion, and moved through the house with a restless energy that even John could sense. The routines she had relied upon for years now seemed strained, imperfect and unpredictable. And though he remained cautious, John could not help but feel that the balance they had maintained for nearly 2 decades was beginning to shift irreversibly. The tension reached a subtle climax one night. A sound, almost imperceptible, echoed through the house. A rustle, a creak, something not quite belonging to either mother or son. Margaret froze, listening, her eyes wide. John held his breath in the hidden chamber, every muscle tensed. The outside world was encroaching, and the fragile equilibrium of their lives had begun to tilt toward a reckoning that neither of them could yet predict. And as always, John whispered softly to himself in the dark, a habit formed over years of isolation. If anyone is following this story, like and comment where you're watching from. Even in the tension and fear, He found a way to connect to the world beyond, a small tether to life outside the shadows of the Thompson house. The days that followed promised change. The careful balance of confinement, secrecy and control that had defined the lives of mother and son for nearly 20 years was now under strain. The Thompson house, long silent and inscrutable, seemed to tremble with anticipation. And somewhere, in the hidden chamber beneath the floorboards, John Thompson began to imagine a life that might finally stretch beyond the walls he had known all his life. The Thompson house, perched at the edge of Ashford, had grown heavier with silence and unspoken tension. Margaret Thompson moved through its halls with a precision that once felt absolute, but now seemed brittle. Her eyes darted at every shadow, her ears strained to catch the faintest creak of floorboards or flutter of curtains. For the first time in decades, she sensed the walls that had once protected her secret were showing signs of weakness. The sense of safety she had built for herself and for John was fraying at the edges. John Thompson, hidden beneath the floorboards in the small chamber that had been both his prison and sanctuary, felt the same change. He had long mastered the rhythm of his mother's movements, the cadence of her warnings, the measured pace of her careful steps. He knew her moods like a map, predicting her reactions with precision. Yet now there was something different, an unpredictability that sent both fear and cautious excitement coursing through him. The house, once predictable, was now alive in new and unsettling ways. A soft knock at the front door shattered the fragile rhythm. Margaret froze mid-step, her hand gripping the edge of the doorframe. Her breath caught. It was not the hesitant knock of a delivery or the polite inquiry of a neighbor. It was deliberate, insistent, and confident. John's pulse quickened, his mind racing with every possibility, the arrival of someone who might uncover their secret, someone who could dismantle the life he had known for 20 years. Margaret approached the door cautiously. Through the narrow window, she saw a man standing with a calm, measured demeanor. Elijah Parker, the peddler who had wandered Ashford before and carried stories, as well as goods from town to town. His eyes were sharp, observant, yet kind, and his presence radiated a quiet insistence that unsettled Margaret. "Margaret," he said, voice low but firm, "I need to speak with you." She took a step back, lips pressing tightly together. A flicker of uncertainty passed over her face, a hesitation that John had never witnessed. Inside, John listened from the hidden chamber, every nerve alert. He could hear the low exchange, her sharp insistence that all was fine, her reminders that John was safe, that the outside world could never understand him. Elijah spoke carefully, gently hinting at the rumors in town, the subtle curiosity that had begun to encroach upon their private world, the faint cries and shadows the townspeople whispered about. Margaret's defenses rose at once, her voice firm yet shaking. She insisted there was nothing to discuss, that their lives were private, that John had been protected and must remain so. Hours passed in tense silence. John crouched in the hidden chamber, muscles coiled, absorbing every word. He felt the familiar tightness of confinement, but now it was mixed with a new sense of possibility and a spark of hope. He had long buried beneath fear and obedience. Every shadow in the room, every movement of Margaret above, was a signpost, a clue, a signal that change might finally be within reach. Elijah's calm persistence tested Margaret's resolve. He walked through the house slowly, noticing subtle details, the creased floorboards near the chamber, the faint impressions in the carpet where someone rarely walked, the quiet evidence of a life kept secret. He did not press aggressively, but his presence reminded both mother and son that the world beyond these walls was real, that the whispers in Ashford were not imaginary, and that secrecy could not endure indefinitely. Margaret's control, formidable for so many years, began to show cracks. Her voice occasionally faltered, her hands shook as she adjusted locks and windows, and a tension that she could not conceal filled every room. She spoke more frequently to John now, but her tone was no longer solely commanding. It was laced with uncertainty and at times regret. "I thought I was protecting you," she said softly one evening, seated by the fire, her hands trembling slightly. "I never wanted the world to hurt you. Perhaps I was wrong." John's breath caught. He had spent nearly 2 decades in this house, listening to warnings, following instructions, and imagining the world beyond walls he could barely see. Hearing words like this, regret, acknowledgement, softness, was almost overwhelming. For the first time, he sensed that his life might not be defined entirely by confinement, that the careful patterns he had learned to survive might no longer dictate every moment. The days following Elijah's visit brought subtle changes. Margaret's vigilance did not vanish entirely, but it softened. Small freedoms were permitted. John could move more openly within the house, perform tasks without constant scrutiny, and linger longer in spaces that had once been inaccessible. The hidden chamber, though still a place of refuge, now felt less like a prison and more like a vantage point from which he could observe a world slowly pressing into view. Rumors in Ashford continued to circulate. The children who dared peek through the fence now whispered with cautious excitement. Neighbors exchanged stories of shadows moving behind curtains, and even the preacher admitted privately that the Thompson household seemed less impenetrable, more alive with the possibility of revelation. The house, once silent and forbidding, had begun to emit subtle signs that life within was stirring beyond strict control. John's imagination, long constrained, began to stretch. He envisioned the streets of Ashford, the sounds of distant voices, the warmth of sunlight on his face. He imagined walking openly, speaking with townspeople, and participating in a world he had never truly experienced. These thoughts were thrilling, but dangerous. Each one carried the weight of possibility and the risk of discovery, yet he could not suppress them. Hope, long buried, was beginning to grow. Evening brought long shadows across the floorboards. John crouched in the hidden chamber, whispering softly to himself, a habit formed over years of isolation. If anyone is following this story, like and comment where you're watching from. It was a small connection to the world beyond, a bridge to people who might never have imagined such a life existed. Even in the face of near freedom, the tether to an audience he had never met offered comfort, grounding him in a reality beyond shadows. Margaret, seated by the fire, stared into the flames with uncharacteristic pensiveness. She did not speak, and yet the silence was heavy with unspoken acknowledgement. The balance she had maintained for nearly 20 years, her rules, her warnings, her control, it was shifting. She recognized it, feared it, and yet seemed powerless to resist it. John, crouched in his chamber, felt the shift palpably. The house was no longer a fortress. It was a fragile boundary that might soon dissolve entirely. Finally, one morning, John emerged from the hidden chamber under the guise of household duties. Margaret watched him, eyes narrowed, but did not intervene. The years of fear, control, and secrecy had given way, if only slightly, to a cautious trust or perhaps weary resignation. He walked through the hallways, feeling the weight of the air differently, sensing the sunlight streaming through the windows, tasting freedom in the smallest gestures. Outside, the town continued its quiet routines, unaware that the story they had only glimpsed in whispers was approaching its next chapter. The Thompson house remained imposing, still secretive, yet life within it had begun to change irrevocably. John's existence, long defined by confinement, had entered a new phase, one shaped by awareness, hope, and the fragile emergence of autonomy. And as he moved through the house, cautiously tasting the possibilities of freedom, John whispered once again, softly, almost reflexively, if anyone is following this story, like and comment where you're watching from. It was the final echo of a life spent largely in shadows, a bridge between the hidden world he had known and the life beyond the walls he was finally beginning to imagine. The Thompson house would always hold its secrets, but the story of John Thompson was no longer entirely contained. The walls that had imprisoned him for 20 years had been weakened not by force, but by time, awareness, and the persistent pull of the world outside. And for the first time, John could step forward cautiously into a life that might finally belong.